If you enjoy heartwarming stories that restore your faith in humanity, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss a story that will touch your heart. The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday afternoon in London, turning the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace into mirrors that reflected the grey sky above. Tourists scattered like pigeons, ducking under umbrellas and rushing toward nearby cafes and covered areas. The usual crowd that gathered to watch the changing of the guard ceremony had thinned considerably, with only the most dedicated visitors remaining behind the iron gates. Among those who stayed was an elderly man named Thomas Webb. At 72 years old, Thomas had called the streets of London home for nearly 5 years. His weathered face told stories of hardship, with deep lines carved by sun, wind, and worry. His clothes were layers of donated items, none matching, all worn thin from constant use. A torn plastic bag served as his only protection against the rain, though it did little good. Water dripped from his gray beard and ran in rivulets down his coat. Thomas stood at the edge of the crowd, separated from the other onlookers, not just by space but by circumstance. People gave him a wide berth, some wrinkling their noses as they passed, others pretending not to see him at all. He was used to being invisible. In a city of millions, the homeless often faded into the background like street furniture, noticed only when they became inconvenient. But Thomas had come to the palace for a reason today. It was November 11th, Remembrance Day, a date that held deep meaning for him. 50 years ago, he had stood in a uniform much like the one worn by the royal guards before him. He had served in the British Army for 12 years, deployed to Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and later to other conflicts that most people had forgotten. Back then, he had been Private Thomas Webb, young and proud, standing at attention just as these guards did now. Life after the military had been difficult. Thomas struggled to adjust to civilian life. The nightmares came frequently, memories of things he wished he could forget. He tried various jobs but could never quite settle. His marriage fell apart when he was 50. He lost touch with his 2 daughters. Then came the layoffs, the mounting debts, and finally, the eviction notice. The path from a small flat to a shelter to the streets had been shorter than he ever imagined possible. Despite everything, Thomas had never forgotten what the uniform meant. Duty, honor, sacrifice. He watched the royal guards standing motionless in the rain, their red tunics darkening with water, their bearskin hats dripping steadily. They did not move, did not seek shelter, did not break their stance. They were soldiers doing their duty, just as he once had. Something stirred in Thomas's chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. It was respect, recognition, and a connection to something larger than his own struggles. These young men and women standing guard were his brothers and sisters in arms, separated by decades but united by service. The rain grew heavier, and the last of the tourists began to leave. Even the most enthusiastic visitors decided that dry clothes and warm food were more appealing than watching guards stand in a downpour. But Thomas remained. His feet ached, his clothes were soaked through, and he was shivering, but he would not leave. Then, slowly, something remarkable began to happen. Thomas straightened his posture, rolling his shoulders back, despite the arthritis that made movement painful. He lifted his chin and planted his feet firmly on the wet pavement. His right hand, gnarled and weathered, rose to his forehead in a crisp military salute. The gesture was perfect, executed with the precision drilled into him half a century ago. Despite the shaking in his arm from cold and age, despite having no umbrella or shelter, Thomas held the salute. He stood at attention in the pouring rain, a homeless man in tattered clothes, rendering honors to the guards who represented everything he once was. One of the royal guards on duty that day was Lance Corporal James Morrison, 24-year-old from Manchester. He had been standing his post for nearly 40 minutes, trained to remain absolutely still, regardless of weather or circumstance. The rain had been relentless, but he maintained his position with the discipline expected of the Queen's Guard. His eyes were supposed to remain fixed ahead, but movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. At first, James thought it was just another tourist taking photos, but something about the figure's stillness made him take notice. Through the corner of his eye, he could see an elderly man standing alone in the rain, arm raised in salute. The man's clothes were ragged, his appearance disheveled, but his military bearing was unmistakable. James had seen enough veterans to recognize one, even in these circumstances. The homeless man held his salute for 1 minute, then 2. His arm never wavered. The rain continued to pour down, but the old man did not lower his hand or seek shelter. James felt something catch in his throat. This was no ordinary gesture. This was a soldier honoring another soldier, regardless of the cost to himself. Palace regulations were strict. Royal guards were not permitted to break their stance, speak, or acknowledge the public in any way during their duty. Moving without orders could result in severe disciplinary action. James had been trained extensively on these protocols. He knew the rules by heart. But as he watched the elderly man standing in the rain, trembling with cold but refusing to break his salute, James made a decision that would change both their lives. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, James's right hand began to move. It was a violation of protocol, something that could end his career. But in that moment, James understood that some things were more important than regulations. The homeless man before him deserved recognition. His service, his sacrifice, his dignity as a soldier, all of it mattered more than any rule. James brought his hand to his forehead and returned the salute. It was brief, lasting only a few seconds before he resumed his standard position. But those few seconds created a connection across time, circumstance, and rank. 2 soldiers, separated by age and fortune, acknowledged each other in a moment of pure respect. Thomas saw the guard return his salute, and tears mixed with rain on his weathered face. For 5 years he had been invisible, ignored, dismissed as just another homeless person cluttering the streets. People looked through him as if he did not exist. Children were pulled away from him. Shop owners asked him to move along. He had become a ghost in his own city. But in that moment, James had seen him. Not as a homeless man, not as a problem to be solved or avoided, but as a fellow soldier worthy of respect. The simple gesture of that return salute meant more to Thomas than any amount of money or food could have. It meant he was still recognized, still valued, still part of something greater than himself. Thomas finally lowered his hand, his arm aching but his heart full. He stood for a moment longer, meeting James's eyes across the distance, and nodded slowly. Then he turned and began to walk away, his steps steadier than they had been in years. But the story did not end there. Several tourists had remained under nearby awnings, sheltering from the rain while still watching the palace. Among them was Sarah Chen, a travel blogger from Singapore. She had witnessed the entire exchange and had managed to capture it on her camera. The photos showed the homeless man, in his tattered clothes, standing at rigid attention with his hand raised in salute. Another photo caught the moment when the royal guard had returned the gesture. Breaking protocol to honor a fellow veteran, Sarah knew immediately that she had witnessed something special. That evening, from her hotel room, she posted the photos to her social media accounts with a detailed description of what she had seen. She wrote about the dignity of the homeless man, the courage of the young guard, and the power of respect that transcended circumstances. By morning, the post had been shared 10,000 times. By afternoon, it had reached 500,000. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines about the homeless veteran and the guard who saluted him. Television programs discussed the incident, debating whether the guard should face discipline or commendation for his actions. The photos went viral across the world, touching hearts in every country and language. Within 48 hours of the photos appearing online, the Ministry of Defense had launched an investigation into the incident. Lance Corporal Morrison was called into his commanding officer's quarters, expecting the worst. He stood at attention before Colonel Patricia Hartley, a stern woman with 30 years of military service behind her. She studied him in silence for what felt like an eternity. Colonel Hartley finally spoke, her voice measured and controlled. She explained that breaking protocol was a serious matter. The Queen's Guard had standards to maintain, and that discipline was the foundation of military service. James listened, his face neutral, prepared to accept whatever consequences came. He regretted nothing. What he had done felt right, and he would do it again. Then Colonel Hartley did something unexpected. She smiled, a warm expression that transformed her usually severe features. She told James that while officially she had to remind him of protocol, unofficially she was proud of him. The ministry had received thousands of messages supporting his actions. Veterans organizations had praised his respect for a fellow serviceman. Even members of parliament had commented positively on the incident. The colonel informed James that instead of discipline, he would receive a commendation for upholding the values of the military, showing compassion and respect in difficult circumstances. The incident had brought positive attention to the armed forces and highlighted the issue of homeless veterans in a way that no campaign had managed to do. But the real question remained: who was the homeless man? Sarah Chen's photos had spread around the world, but nobody knew his identity. News organizations launched appeals for information. The hashtag #FindTheVeteran began trending. People across London started looking for the elderly man who had stood in the rain to salute the guards. Thomas knew nothing of any of this. He did not own a phone or computer. He had no access to social media or news websites. He spent his days in the same routine he had followed for years, moving between different areas of the city, finding food where he could, sleeping in doorways or shelters when space was available. The day after his tribute at the palace, he was simply trying to stay warm and dry. It was 3 days after the incident when Thomas was found. He was sitting in his usual spot near a charity shop in Camden, a cardboard cup in front of him with a few coins inside. A young woman approached him, her phone in hand, showing him the screen. She asked if he was the man in the photos. Thomas squinted at the image, barely recognizing himself in the rain-soaked figure standing at attention. The young woman made a phone call. And within an hour, Thomas was surrounded by people. Journalists arrived with cameras and microphones. Representatives from veterans organizations came with warm clothes and offers of help. Social workers appeared with information about housing programs. The attention was overwhelming for a man who had become accustomed to being ignored, but one visitor stood out from all the others. James Morrison arrived in civilian clothes, having used his day off to search for Thomas. When the two men saw each other, no words were needed initially. They simply shook hands, a firm grip that conveyed mutual respect and understanding. James thanked Thomas for his service. Thomas thanked James for seeing him when he had become invisible to the world. Their meeting was captured by news, cameras, and shared widely. The image of the young soldier and the elderly veteran shaking hands became as iconic as the original photos of the salute. It represented hope, connection, and the enduring bonds of military service. The Royal British Legion, one of the UK's largest veterans' charities, immediately stepped forward with an offer of support. They had been trying for years to address the issue of homeless veterans, but public attention had always been limited. Now, with Thomas's story capturing international interest, they saw an opportunity to make real change. Within a week, the charity had arranged temporary accommodation for Thomas in a veterans' housing facility. It was nothing fancy, just a small room with a bed, a desk, and a window. But to Thomas, it felt like a palace. He had his own space, his own key, and most importantly, his own dignity restored. For the first time in 5 years, he slept in a proper bed with clean sheets and woke up without fear of being moved along by police or security guards. The support that poured in for Thomas was extraordinary. Sarah Chen's original post had sparked a crowdfunding campaign that raised over £200,000 in donations from people around the world. Many donors were veterans themselves. Others were simply moved by Thomas's story and wanted to help. The money was placed in a trust managed by the Royal British Legion, ensuring that Thomas would have financial security for the first time in years. Medical care became a priority. Thomas had not seen a doctor in 5 years, relying on emergency services only when absolutely necessary. Now he received a complete health assessment. Doctors discovered untreated diabetes, severe arthritis in his joints, and dental problems that had gone unaddressed for years. A treatment plan was developed, and slowly, Thomas began to feel physically better than he had in a long time. But the emotional and psychological recovery was more complex. Thomas met with counselors who specialized in working with veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. For years, he had carried the weight of his experiences alone. never discussing the nightmares or the memories that haunted him. Now in a safe environment with people who understood, he began to unpack decades of suppressed trauma. The sessions were difficult. Thomas cried often, something he had not allowed himself to do in years. He talked about the friends he had lost in service, the violence he had witnessed, and his guilt over being unable to prevent tragedies. He discussed his failed marriage, his estrangement from his daughters, and the shame he felt about becoming homeless. The counselors listened without judgment, helping him understand that his struggles were not personal failures but common challenges faced by many veterans. Meanwhile, James Morrison's life had changed as well. The young Lance Corporal became a symbol of compassion and respect for veterans. He was invited to speak at military events and charity functions, sharing his perspective on that rainy day at Buckingham Palace. James always insisted he was not a hero, that he had simply done what felt right in the moment. But his humility only made people admire him more. The friendship between James and Thomas grew stronger. They met regularly for coffee or meals. Two soldiers from different generations, finding common ground in their shared experiences. James learned about military history from Thomas's first-hand accounts. While Thomas appreciated James's fresh perspective on modern service, their conversations ranged from serious discussions about military life to lighthearted jokes and stories. Thomas's daughters, Emma and Claire, had learned about their father's situation through the news coverage. They had not spoken to him in over 15 years, the relationship having deteriorated after their parents' divorce. Both women felt a mixture of emotions: guilt over having lost contact, anger over past hurts, but also hope that reconciliation might be possible. Claire, the younger daughter, reached out first. She contacted the Royal British Legion and asked if they could arrange a meeting. The charity's social workers facilitated the reunion carefully, preparing both Thomas and Claire for the emotional encounter. They met in a quiet room at the Veterans Center, both nervous and uncertain. The first meeting was awkward, filled with long silences and careful words. There was too much history, too much pain to address in one conversation. But it was a start. Claire explained that she had always wondered where her father was, that she had worried about him over the years but had not known how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. Thomas apologized for disappearing from their lives, for allowing his struggles to separate him from his family. Over the following weeks, Claire visited several more times. She brought photos of her own children, Thomas's grandchildren, whom he had never met. She shared updates about her life, her career as a teacher, her marriage, her daily routines. Slowly, they began to rebuild a connection that had been broken for so long. Emma, the older daughter, was more hesitant, her wounds deeper, but eventually she agreed to meet as well. The reunions were not perfect. There were still disagreements, old resentments that surfaced during conversations. Moments of tension when past hurts felt too fresh, but everyone involved was willing to try to work through the difficulties because they recognized that family mattered. Even when it was complicated, Thomas began to envision a future again. For years he had lived day to day, focused only on immediate survival. Now he could think beyond the next meal or the next night's shelter. He started making plans, small ones at first, but plans nonetheless. He wanted to volunteer at veterans organizations to help others who were struggling as he had struggled. He hoped to spend more time with his grandchildren, to be part of their lives in whatever way his daughters would allow. 6 months after the incident in the rain, Thomas stood before an audience of 300 people at a veterans charity gala in London. He wore a suit donated by a local business, the first proper suit he had worn in many years. His hair was neatly trimmed, his beard shaped, and though his hands still shook slightly from nerves, he stood tall and confident. The event was raising money for homeless veteran programs, and Thomas had been asked to share his story. Public speaking terrified him, but he felt obligated to help others who remained on the streets. Invisible and forgotten as he had been, James Morrison sat in the front row, offering an encouraging smile. Thomas spoke about his military service, his descent into homelessness, and the day he decided to salute the Royal Guard in the rain. His voice cracked with emotion several times, but he pushed through. He described what it felt like to be invisible, to walk through crowds of people who looked right through him as if he did not exist. He talked about the shame of asking for spare change, the fear of sleeping on cold streets, and the loss of hope that came with each passing day. But he also spoke about redemption and second chances. He thanked James for seeing him when others did not, for taking a risk to return his salute. He thanked Sarah Chen for sharing his story with the world. He thanked the Royal British Legion and all the donors who had contributed to his recovery. Most importantly, he thanked his daughters for giving him another opportunity to be part of their lives. The audience listened in complete silence, many wiping away tears. When Thomas finished speaking, the entire room rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. People were not just applauding Thomas, they were acknowledging all the homeless veterans who struggled in silence, recognizing their service and their dignity. The gala raised over £1 million that night, far exceeding the organizers' expectations. The money went toward expanding housing programs for homeless veterans, funding mental health services, and creating job training opportunities. Thomas's story had done more than save one man. It had sparked a movement to help thousands. In the months that followed, Thomas became a regular volunteer at the Veterans Center where he lived. He met with newly homeless veterans, offering guidance and understanding that only someone who had experienced it could provide. He knew which shelters were safe, which charities offered the best support, and how to navigate the complex system of services available. But more than practical advice, he offered hope, living proof that circumstances could change. One cold evening in March, Thomas was walking through the same area where he used to sleep rough. He saw a young man, probably in his 30s, sitting against a wall with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The man's eyes had that hollow look Thomas remembered so well, the expression of someone who had given up hope. Thomas stopped and sat down beside him. The young man was named David, a former soldier who had served in Afghanistan. He had been homeless for 8 months, struggling with injuries and trauma from his service. Thomas listened to his story, hearing echoes of his own experiences. He did not offer empty platitudes or quick solutions. Instead, he shared his own journey, speaking honestly about the challenges and the small steps that had led to his recovery. Thomas gave David the contact information for the Veterans Center and promised to meet him there the next day if he wanted help. He also gave him £20 from his own pocket, money from his monthly stipend. As Thomas walked away, he looked back to see David holding the card, actually reading it rather than throwing it away. It was a small moment, but Thomas knew from experience that small moments could change everything. His relationship with his daughters continued to develop, though not without difficulties. Emma remained somewhat distant, the wounds of their separation deeper and harder to heal. But Claire had become a regular part of his life. She visited weekly, bringing her 2 children, 8-year-old Sophie and 6-year-old Michael. The children called him Granddad Thomas, and their innocent affection healed something in him that he thought had been permanently broken. Thomas attended Sophie's school play, sitting in the audience with tears streaming down his face as she performed on stage. He taught Michael how to play chess, passing on a skill his own father had taught him decades ago. These simple moments of family connection meant more to him than all the media attention or public recognition he had received. James Morrison remained a close friend, checking in regularly and joining Thomas for monthly dinners. They had formed a bond that transcended their initial encounter, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. James brought his girlfriend to meet Thomas, and later that year, Thomas was honored to be invited to their engagement party. November 11th arrived again. 1 year after Thomas had stood in the rain to salute the Royal Guard, the anniversary had been marked in calendars by various organizations planning commemorative events. The Royal British Legion organized a special ceremony at Buckingham Palace, inviting Thomas, James, and other veterans who had been affected by the story. The weather was clear and cold, a stark contrast to the rainy day that had started everything. Thomas arrived wearing his old military medals, which had been recovered from storage and polished to shine like new. He walked through the palace gates as an honored guest, rather than an invisible homeless man. But he never forgot how different things had been just 12 months earlier. During the ceremony, both Thomas and James were presented with special recognition awards for their contributions to veteran welfare and for exemplifying the values of military service. Thomas accepted his award with humility, insisting that he had done nothing special. He had simply shown respect in the only way he knew how. But everyone present understood that his simple act had created ripples that spread far beyond that single rainy day. The young man Thomas had met on the street, David, was also present at the ceremony. With Thomas's guidance and the support of veteran services, David had found housing and was receiving treatment for his injuries. He had started a training program to become a mechanic, using skills he had learned in the military. David credited Thomas with saving his life, though Thomas dismissed such claims, saying he had simply shown David that help was available if he was ready to accept it. Sarah Chen had flown in from Singapore for the anniversary event. She spoke about how sharing Thomas's story had reminded her why she became a travel blogger in the first place. To capture authentic human moments that connected people across cultures and borders, she had since focused her content on highlighting social issues and inspiring stories. Using her platform for positive change, after the formal ceremony, Thomas requested a private moment at the spot where he had stood in the rain. Palace officials agreed, and Thomas found himself once again outside the gates, looking at the guards on duty. But this time, he was not alone. James stood beside him, along with Emma and Claire. His grandchildren, David, and dozens of other veterans who had been helped by the programs funded through his story. Thomas thought about the journey of the past year. He had gone from complete despair to hope, from invisibility to recognition, from isolation to community. But the most important change was internal. He had forgiven himself for his struggles and accepted that asking for help was not a weakness but a necessary step toward healing. He looked at the guard standing in the cold, a young woman maintaining her position with perfect discipline. Thomas rendered a salute once more, not as a desperate homeless man seeking connection, but as a veteran honoring the continuing tradition of service. The guard, following proper protocol this time, did not return the salute while on duty, but Thomas saw her eyes shift momentarily to meet his, and in that brief glance, he saw understanding and respect. The moment felt like a completion, a full circle from desperation to redemption. But Thomas knew this was not really an ending. It was a new beginning, a continuation of his journey toward healing and purpose. There were still difficult days, moments when the past weighed heavily, and challenges that seemed overwhelming. Recovery was not a straight line but a winding path with setbacks and obstacles. Yet Thomas faced the future with hope he had not felt in years. He had plans to advocate for policy changes to support homeless veterans. He wanted to share his story at schools and military bases, helping young people understand the realities of military service and the importance of supporting veterans. He hoped to continue rebuilding his relationships with his daughters and being present in his grandchildren's lives. As the group prepared to leave the palace grounds, Thomas took one last look at the guards, the gates, and the spot where he had stood in the rain. He remembered the man he had been that day, desperate and alone, seeking acknowledgement in a world that had forgotten him. He thought about James, a young soldier who had risked his career to show compassion, and he considered all the people whose lives had been touched by one simple gesture of respect. Thomas turned away from the palace and walked toward his family and friends, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, but recognized for exactly what he was and always had been. A soldier who had served his country with honor and deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The rain had washed away more than just the dirt of the streets that day. It had washed away the barriers between people, revealing the fundamental humanity that connected them all. In the end, Thomas's tribute in the rain had been more than a salute. It had been a reminder that every person has worth, that service deserves recognition regardless of circumstances, and that sometimes the smallest acts of respect can create the biggest changes. His story would continue to inspire others for years to come. A testament to the power of seeing people for who they truly are rather than judging them by their current situation. Thomas Webb, former private in the British Army, former homeless man, and now advocate for veterans everywhere, walked into the future with his head held high, knowing that he had found his way home at last, not just to shelter and family, but to himself.